The crowd gathered like vultures around fresh carrion, their expensive suits and designer handbags creating a stark contrast against the dusty rodeo grounds. At the center of their fascination stood Midnight's Crown, a magnificent Arabian stallion, worth $3 million, his black coat gleaming like polished obsidian under the Arizona sun. The horse stood frozen, every muscle taut as steel cable, refusing to move despite the increasingly frantic efforts of his handlers, Garrison Beaumont. Thury adjusted his platinum cufflinks and checked his Patek Philippe watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes. The tech mogul had flown in from Silicon Valley specifically for this moment, the public debut of his prized stallion at the Phoenix Equestrian Championships. His investment portfolio included everything from artificial intelligence startups to space exploration ventures, but horses were his true passion, his escape from the digital world that had made him worth $47 billion. "What's wrong with him?" Garrison demanded, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man unaccustomed to things not going according to plan. The head trainer, a weathered man named Rodriguez, who'd worked with thoroughbreds for 30 years, shook, his head in bewilderment. "I've never seen anything like it, Mr. Beaumont. He was fine this morning, ate his oats, responded to commands, everything normal. But the moment we brought him out here..." Rodriguez gestured helplessly at the stallion, who stood like a statue carved from shadow. The horse's eyes, normally alert and intelligent, held something deeper now, a distant look that seemed to pierce through the present moment into some unreachable past. His breathing remained steady, but he wouldn't budge an inch forward or backward. Professional photographers captured every angle of the standoff, their cameras clicking like mechanical insects. From the edge of the crowd, a figure watched with knowing eyes. Cordelia Wickham had seen this before, though not in many years. The 73-year-old woman had lived on the same patch of land for 4 decades, her small farm existing like an island of simplicity in an ocean of increasing development. Her weathered hands, stained with honest soil, clutched a worn leather satchel containing herbs and remedies that city folk would dismiss as folklore. She'd come to town not for the horse show, but to sell her organic vegetables at the farmer's market. Yet something had drawn her here, some invisible thread that connected her past to this moment. As she watched the expensive chaos unfold around the frozen stallion, memories stirred like sediment in still water. The crowd grew restless. Veterinarians were summoned, their clinical assessments yielding nothing conclusive. Midnight's Crown appeared physically perfect, no injuries, no obvious distress, no medical explanation for his sudden paralysis. Garrison's face reddened as the minutes ticked by, his business empire built on precision and results crumbling around one horse's inexplicable behavior. "Perhaps we should postpone," Rodriguez began, but Garrison cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Absolutely not. I have investors here, media coverage, sponsors watching. This horse will perform, or I'll find out exactly why he won't." His words carried the weight of a man who'd never encountered a problem that money couldn't solve. But as the sun climbed higher and the crowd's murmurs grew louder, it became clear that Midnight's Crown existed in a realm beyond wealth and influence. A place where the past held more power than any billionaire's fortune. The veterinarians had exhausted their medical arsenal. Dr. Patricia Vance, one of the country's leading equine specialists, stood back from Midnight's Crown with professionally concealed frustration. Her examination had revealed a horse in perfect physical condition, yet completely unresponsive to external stimuli. His heart rate is normal, pupils responsive, no signs of neurological damage, she reported to Garrison, who paced behind her like a caged predator. "But there's something else, something I can't quantify in medical terms. It's as if he's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Garrison snapped, his patience evaporating like morning dew under the desert sun. Dr. Vance shrugged helplessly. "I wish I knew." From her position at the crowd's periphery, Cordelia studied the stallion's posture, the set of his head, the particular way his ears remained pricked forward despite his stillness. Details that meant nothing to the assembled wealth began forming a pattern in her mind. A pattern she recognized from a lifetime spent understanding the unspoken language between humans and horses. She approached slowly, her presence barely noticed, among the chaos of expensive confusion. The closer she got to Midnight's crown, the more certain she became. This wasn't random behavioral dysfunction. This was recognition. "Excuse me," she said quietly to Rodriguez, who stood closest to the rope barrier. Her voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd spent decades earning trust, rather than demanding it. Rodriguez glanced down at the elderly woman, noting her simple cotton dress and practical boots, so different from the designer-clad spectators. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but this is a restricted area. The horse is—" "I know what the horse is," Cordelia interrupted gently. "The question is whether you're willing to listen to someone who might actually be able to help." Garrison overheard and turned, his expression shifting from annoyance to barely contained rage. "Lady, I don't know who you are, but I've got the best animal specialist money can buy working on this problem. I hardly think some local what?" Cordelia's voice remained calm, but steel entered her eyes. "Someone who's forgotten more about horses than your specialists ever learned from their textbooks?" The crowd sensed drama and pressed closer. Cameras swiveled toward the confrontation, sensing a story more compelling than a frozen horse. Garrison's media training kicked in. He couldn't afford to look like he was dismissing a harmless old woman in front of reporters. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "You have 5 minutes, but when your folk remedies fail, I want you gone." Cordelia nodded and approached the rope barrier. But instead of crossing into the arena, she simply stood there, studying Midnight's crown with the intensity of someone reading a beloved but complex book. The stallion's ears swiveled toward her, voice when she began to speak, though he remained otherwise motionless. "Beautiful boy," she murmured, just loud enough for the horse to hear. "You remember, don't you? You remember the red dirt and the cottonwood trees. You remember the smell of wild sage after rain and the sound of meadowlarks in the morning." Something flickered in the stallion's eyes, not quite movement, but a subtle shift in attention that Dr. Vance noticed immediately. "What is she doing?" the veterinarian whispered to Rodriguez. "I have no idea," he replied, but his voice carried wonder rather than skepticism. Cordelia continued speaking in her soft, weathered voice, painting pictures with words that seemed to reach into some hidden chamber of Midnight's crown's consciousness. She spoke of wide open spaces and freedom, of the particular quality of light that painted the desert at sunset, of the ancient connection between horse and human that existed long before money corrupted the relationship. The crowd fell silent, drawn into the spell of her words despite themselves. Even Garrison found his anger cooling, replaced by something he couldn't quite name, a recognition that he was witnessing something beyond his experience or understanding. Midnight's crown's breathing deepened, and for the first time since the standoff began, he shifted his weight from one hoof to another. The subtle shift in Midnight's crown's posture sent ripples through the gathered crowd. Dr. Vance stepped closer, her professional skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence. Before her eyes, the stallion's rigid stance had softened almost imperceptibly, like ice beginning to thaw at winter's end. Cordelia continued her gentle monologue, her words painting landscapes that existed more in memory than geography. She spoke of dawn rides, through arroyos where ancient petroglyphs watched from canyon walls, of the particular way desert wildflowers bloomed after rare rains, of the trust that developed between horse and rider when survival depended on mutual understanding rather than dominance. "This is ridiculous," Garrison muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. He'd built his empire on data and algorithms, on quantifiable results and predictable outcomes. Yet something in the old woman's presence suggested knowledge that existed outside his digital universe. "Tell me about his bloodline," Cordelia said suddenly, her eyes never leaving the stallion. Rodriguez consulted his tablet. Sired by Desert Storm's legacy, Dam was Sahara's dream. Both champions, both from established Arabian breeding programs. Nothing unusual in his lineage. "No," Cordelia shook her head. "Tell me about his real bloodline. Where did his great-grandfather come from before the breeding farms and registration papers?" The trainer's brow furrowed. "I'd have to research that. Most people don't trace back that far unless there's a specific genetic concern. There should be records, Dr. Vance interjected, her curiosity piqued despite herself. Arabian horses have some of the most detailed bloodline documentation in the world. As Rodriguez worked his tablet, searching through digital genealogies, Cordelia moved closer to the rope barrier. Midnight's Crown's ears tracked her movement, and she could see something stirring in those dark eyes. Recognition fighting against years of conditioning and training. Here, Rodriguez said finally. His great-grandfather was a stallion called Windwalker. Apparently he was captured wild in New Mexico. Says here he was sold to a private ranch in 1978, then eventually entered the breeding program. Cordelia's weathered face grew thoughtful. Windwalker, and what happened to that private ranch? Doesn't say. The records just show the horse was transferred to the breeding program in 1985. But Cordelia knew. She'd known the moment she saw Midnight's Crown's particular stance, the way he held his head, the intelligent defiance in his eyes. 40 years melted away like morning mist, and she was 25 again, working alongside her late husband on their struggling ranch in the high desert country of New Mexico. They'd found Windwalker injured, a magnificent stallion with a gash on his flank. From barbed wire, wild and terrified, but somehow trusting enough to let them help. For 7 years, he'd been more than their horse. He'd been their partner, their friend, the living embodiment of everything they'd loved about the untamed country they called home. When the drought came and the bank foreclosed, they'd sold Windwalker to save what little they could. It had broken their hearts, but they'd convinced themselves he'd have a better life with people who could afford proper care. Now, looking at his great-grandson, Cordelia understood that some bonds transcend genetics, that memory could travel through bloodlines like water through underground streams. Midnight's Crown wasn't just remembering. He was carrying forward the accumulated longing of his ancestors for the freedom they'd lost. "I need to get closer to him," she said quietly. "Absolutely not," Garrison protested. "He's worth $3 million. I can't have some stranger." "Some stranger who's the only person here he's actually responding to?" Dr. Vance interrupted. The veterinarian had noticed what the others missed. Midnight's Crown's breathing had synchronized with Cordelia's speech patterns. His ears remained focused on her voice, and the tension in his muscles had continued to ease with each word she spoke. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that whatever was happening had moved beyond spectacle into something more profound. Camera phones captured every moment, but the technology felt inadequate to document the subtle communication occurring between the elderly woman and the frozen stallion. Cordelia reached into her leather satchel, not for herbs or remedies, but for something far more precious, a photograph creased and faded, showing a magnificent wild stallion standing free against a backdrop of endless sky. The photograph trembled slightly in Cordelia's weathered hands as she held it up where Midnight's Crown could see. The faded image showed Windwalker in his prime, captured in a moment of pure freedom on the high plains of New Mexico. The resemblance between great-grandfather and great-grandson was unmistakable. The same noble bearing, the same intelligent eyes, the same proud arch of the neck that spoke of royal bloodlines that predated human interference. Midnight's Crown's reaction was immediate and profound. His nostrils flared as if catching a scent carried on memory's wind, and a low, almost inaudible whinny escaped his throat, the first sound he'd made since his paralysis began. "Jesus," Rodriguez whispered, his tablet forgotten in his hands. "Look at his eyes." The stallion's gaze had locked onto the photograph with an intensity that made the assembled crowd fall silent. It was as if he was seeing not just an image, but a doorway into a heritage that years of breeding programs and training regimens had tried to erase. Dr. Vance moved closer, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. "This shouldn't be possible," she murmured. "Horses don't have genetic memory in any way that would explain this level of recognition." "Maybe," Cordelia said softly. "Science doesn't explain everything." Garrison found himself caught between worlds, the rational universe of his business, empire and something older, deeper, that his wealth couldn't purchase or his technology couldn't quantify. The crowd's expensive cameras captured the moment, but he understood instinctively that they were recording something that transcended mere spectacle. "What happened to Windwalker?" he asked quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. Cordelia's eyes never left Midnight's crown as she answered. "He spent 7 years with us, free to roam 30,000 acres of high desert. Every morning, he'd come to the fence when my husband whistled, not because he had to, but because he chose to. He was wild, but he was also family." She paused, the weight of old grief settling over her features like twilight shadows. "When the drought came and lasted 3 years, we lost everything. The cattle died, the wells went dry, and the bank came calling. We had to sell him to a breeding program. Told ourselves it was for his own good, that he'd have regular meals and veterinary care, but we knew we were trading his freedom for his survival." Midnight's crown stepped forward, just one step, but it sent a collective gasp through the crowd, his first voluntary movement in over 2 hours. "He never forgot," Cordelia continued. "And somehow, through all the generations since, that memory of freedom, that longing for the wide spaces and the wild wind, passed down to this beautiful boy." Rodriguez checked his tablet again, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen. "According to the records, Windwalker lived to be 31. That's ancient for a stallion. And he kept trying to escape. The breeding facility had to reinforce their fences 3 times because of him. He was looking for us," Cordelia said simply. "Looking for home." Dr. Vance shook her head in amazement. "But that still doesn't explain how Midnight's crown could possibly remember what it felt like to be free," Cordelia finished. "Maybe memory isn't just in the brain, Doctor. Maybe it lives in the blood, in the bones, in the very marrow of what makes a creature who it is." The stallion took another step forward, his magnificent head lowering slightly, as if acknowledging the truth in her words. The crowd remained frozen, witnesses to something that defied easy explanation, but felt undeniably real. Garrison found, his voice, though it came out rougher than usual. "What does he want?" Cordelia looked at the billionaire with eyes that had seen too much of life to judge harshly. "The same thing his great-grandfather wanted. The same thing every wild creature wants when it's been caged, no matter how golden the cage might be." She folded the photograph carefully and returned it to her satchel, then looked directly at Midnight's crown. The stallion's ears pricked forward, as if waiting for something specific, something that would unlock the paralysis that had held him, frozen between past and present. "There's one word," she said quietly, "one word that Windwalker knew, that meant freedom and choice and the vast sky above the mesa. If I say it, if this boy truly carries his great-grandfather's memory in his blood, he'll remember what it means to run free." The arena fell silent, except for the whisper of desert wind and the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. The silence stretched like a held breath across the arena. Even the ever-present Arizona wind seemed to pause, as if the desert itself was listening. Midnight's crown stood poised on the edge of decision, his powerful frame trembling with suppressed energy, waiting for something that lived deeper than instinct or training. Cordelia closed her eyes and let herself drift back 40 years, to dawn mornings when the world was painted in shades of rose and gold, when her husband would step onto the porch with his coffee and call across the endless expanse of their ranch. She could almost hear his voice again, weathered and warm, carrying across time like an echo from a better world. "The word," she said quietly, opening her eyes to meet Midnight's crown's intelligent gaze, was adelante. The Spanish word for forward or onward hung in the air like a key turning in, a long-locked door. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Midnight's crown's entire body shuddered, as if electricity had passed through him from mane to tail. The stallion's head lifted high, his nostrils flaring wide, and suddenly he wasn't a $3 million investment or a prized breeding specimen. He was Windwalker's descendant, carrying in his blood the memory of freedom that no amount of money could purchase or training could erase. Adelante, Cordelia repeated, her voice stronger now, carrying all the love and loss of 4 decades. Midnight's crown exploded into motion. But it wasn't the frenzied panic that everyone expected. Instead, the stallion moved with fluid grace, his hooves drumming against the earth in a rhythm that seemed older than civilization. He didn't bolt or buck. He danced, his movements speaking, a language that predated words, telling the story of wild horses running across endless plains under star-drunk skies. The crowd gasped as Midnight's crown began to canter in a perfect circle around the arena, his black coat gleaming like liquid starlight. There was joy in his movement, pure and undiluted, the kind of happiness that comes from remembering who you truly are beneath all the layers of expectation and constraint. Dr. Vance stood transfixed, her scientific training warring with the evidence of her senses. "This is impossible," she whispered, but her voice carried wonder rather than denial. Rodriguez crossed himself, his weathered face slack with amazement. In 30 years of working with horses, he'd never seen anything like the transformation before him. Midnight's crown moved as if he'd shed an invisible burden, as if the word Adelante had broken chains that existed more in spirit than steel. But it was Garrison's reaction that surprised everyone most. The billionaire stood perfectly still, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The business part of his mind calculated the chaos this would cause, the disrupted schedules, the disappointed investors, the media attention focused on something he couldn't control or understand. Yet another part of him, a part he'd thought buried under decades of corporate warfare and digital ambition, recognized something profound in the stallion's liberation. For the first time in years, he was watching something that couldn't be bought, sold, or optimized, something that simply was magnificent and free. Midnight's crown slowed his canter and approached the rope barrier where Cordelia stood. He lowered his great head until his muzzle nearly touched her weathered hand, and she could see in his dark eyes the echo of every sunrise Windwalker had ever watched from the high mesas of New Mexico. "I know, beautiful boy," she whispered. "I know what you're remembering. The red earth and the piñon pines, the scent of sage after rain, the feeling of ground beneath your hooves that had no fences, no boundaries, no limits except the horizon itself." The stallion breathed softly against her palm, and in that moment, the expensive chaos of the arena faded away. There was only this connection, this recognition that spanned generations and spoke to something deeper than ownership or commerce. "What happens now?" Garrison asked quietly. His voice had lost its earlier edge, replaced by something that might have been humility. Cordelia looked at him with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of dreams, the way love and loss intertwined like desert vines around the human heart. "That depends on you, Mr. Beaumont. You can try to train this wildness out of him, lock him back in the cage of expectations and breeding schedules. Or," she paused, letting the weight of possibility settle over them all, "or you can remember that some things are worth more than money." The crowd remained frozen in the aftermath of Midnight's crown's transformation, cameras capturing, but unable to contain the electric moment that had passed between the stallion and the elderly woman. Garrison found himself at a crossroads he'd never anticipated, one that couldn't be resolved with market analysis or strategic planning. "You're asking me to give up a $3 million horse," he said quietly. But there was no anger in his voice now, only a kind of wondering uncertainty. "I'm not asking you to give up anything," Cordelia replied gently. "I'm asking you to consider what you might gain." Dr. Vance approached the rope barrier, her professional composure cracked by what she'd witnessed. "Mr. Beaumont, in my 20 years of veterinary practice, I've never seen anything like this. This horse, he's trying to tell us something important." Rodriguez nodded emphatically. "She's right. In all my years training horses, I've learned that the really special ones, the ones with greatness in their blood, they need more than food and shelter. They need purpose, meaning, Garrison looked at Midnight's Crown, who stood calmly now, his earlier frenzy replaced by alert contentment. The stallion's eyes held depths that seemed to encompass generations of memory. Freedom lost and found and lost again. Hope passed down through bloodlines like a treasured heirloom. "What are you suggesting?" Garrison asked. Cordelia reached into her leather satchel and withdrew a different photograph, this one more recent, showing her small farm with its simple barn and endless views of desert sky. "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Beaumont. I'm offering you a choice. You can take Midnight's Crown back to his climate-controlled stable, his breeding schedule, his life of luxury and limitation. Or," she paused, her weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing, "or you can let him come home, to a place where he can run free, where he can remember what his great-grandfather knew about the relationship between horse and human, where he can be a partner instead of property." The crowd murmured among themselves, sensing drama but not understanding its true significance. Reporters leaned closer with their microphones, ready to capture whatever decision the billionaire would make. But Garrison wasn't thinking about publicity or business implications. He was remembering his own childhood, before the tech empire and the billions of dollars, when he'd spent summers at his grandfather's modest ranch in Montana. He remembered the freedom of those days, the sense of possibility that came with wide-open spaces and the feeling that anything could happen if you were brave enough to let it. "I built my fortune by recognizing value that others missed," he said slowly, "by understanding that sometimes the most important things can't be quantified." He looked at Cordelia, this remarkable woman who'd appeared from nowhere and accomplished what teams of specialists couldn't. "What would you do with him?" "What my husband and I did with Windwalker," she replied. "Love him, respect him, give him the space to be who he truly is, and in return he'll teach us things about trust and freedom that no amount of money can buy." Midnight's Crown stepped closer to the barrier, his noble head reaching toward Cordelia, as if drawn by invisible threads of connection that spanned decades and generations. Garrison made his decision. "Rodriguez, call my lawyers. I want the ownership. Papers transferred to Mrs." He paused, realizing he didn't even know her name. "Wickham," Cordelia supplied softly. "Cordelia Wickham." "To Mrs. Wickham. No charge, no conditions." He looked directly at the elderly woman. "But I have one request." "What's that?" "I'd like to visit sometimes, to see him run free, to remember what I used to know about the important things in life." Cordelia smiled, her weathered face transforming with warmth. "Mr. Beaumont, you'll always be welcome, both of you." As if understanding the conversation, Midnight's Crown nickered softly, a sound of contentment and anticipation. The crowd began to disperse, confused by the anticlimactic ending to what they'd expected to be a spectacular horse show. But for those who understood what had truly happened, the recognition of genetic memory, the power of freedom over wealth, the choice to honor heritage instead of profit, this was the most spectacular show of all. 3 months later, visitors to Cordelia's small farm could see Midnight's Crown running free across 30 acres of high desert, his black coat gleaming against the red earth as he followed paths that his great-grandfather had once traced in dreams of home. And sometimes, early in the morning when the light painted the world in shades of gold and possibility, a certain billionaire could be found sitting on the porch with Cordelia, drinking coffee and watching a $3 million horse remember what it meant to be truly priceless. The word Adelante had unlocked more than a stallion's paralysis. It had opened the door to understanding that some treasures can only be found when you're willing to let them go free.